Hello, John.
Hey, Swapna, how are you? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. I just wanted to, log in a little bit early on to see what the setup would be like. So you can just, feel free to ignore me. I'm just now setting up things here.
Swapna, can you try talking? I want to see if you're coming through the big speakers here.
Yeah, can you hear me okay on the speakers?
Yeah, you're not. Let me just see what I got for output here. Can you just try talking again? I want to see if you're coming through my speakers.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, actually we can. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfect.
That's good. That's good. And I want to make sure I get you set up. Let's see. More.
I also wanted to just check in how you were doing any group work or group discussions. So, because I'm guessing no one is sort of sitting close to each other. So are they using Zoom between them to do that?
No, they're all here in Craig with me.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that's not working is the Zoom room component of the thing, which means that I'll probably have to repeat their questions because the mic in the room isn't working right now. So basically we're using the mic on my computer.
Oh, and if I'm asking them any questions, then I guess you'll have to translate.
Yeah, I will. So that's what we'll have to do is you'll have to, because for some reason this projector system never works quite right. So I'm kind of running Zoom through my computer, but displaying it on the screen and running the audio through the screen so they can hear you. But you can't see the room.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, so you should feel free to go ahead and ask the questions. I'll just probably have to repeat them. I may be able to turn my computer around and you may be able to just pick it up on my mic. So it may actually work fine. I mean, we've done that before.
Yeah, I think turning the computer around might be one way to go about it, I think. Just so that I get a sense of the class, what it's like, but I'll leave that to you.
I think it'll work. I think it'll work just fine. People still seem to be rolling in at the moment. So let me just give them a second and let's see. So I'm going to go ahead, I think, and get started. But I guess the one thing I want to make sure to do is get you set up so that you are a presenter.
Yeah, I just had this screen that I wanted to
Right,
share.
you're gonna be able to do that. Okay, so
Okay.
if you don't mind, I think the easiest, I could take a little bit of time at the beginning, at the end, but why don't I take a couple minutes right at the beginning, and then you'll have until 10:50. So I'll just do some intro stuff here at
Okay.
the start. I just need to say a couple things about the
All
site.
right. Let me know whenever I can share my screen and we
Okay,
can...
I'll do that.
Okay.
Let me go ahead and share my screen for a second, though. Let's see. All right. Which one of these is the one I want? I think this is it. Let's see if we got it here. All right. So welcome, folks. Great to have you here. I'm really excited to share one of my colleagues today, Swapna Pathak, who's going to talk a little bit about political systems. As I've mentioned before, Dr. Pathak teaches the policy course that's required for the ES major. But I think her participation in class today is actually kind of perfectly set up in terms of the prior discussion we had of climate change and next Tuesday's class, in which we're going to focus on a case study that looks at climate change. And I just wanted to say a tiny bit about the schedule and about assignments before we launch into today's, just to give you a little bit of context for where we are and where we're headed. So as you folks know, let me just make it a bit bigger. Okay. Here, down here. Yeah, right. So as you guys know, you have last class, you had comments to your group members on their community voices material they developed. And I know some of you are still wrapping that up. We'll begin looking at that this weekend, Maddie and I. And I might say a moment about some of the content you've developed, because I think it's pretty darn cool. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact that today, and almost all of you have done this, you are to sign up for an interview with an Oberlin Oberlin student. I actually, let me point out one thing about that spreadsheet, which I might open for a second here, if I have the right spreadsheet open. All right. Okay, so this is the spreadsheet you guys have been shared on, that has the opportunities for interviewing different community members. And I just want to point out that people were still filling out our form and signing up, even while you guys were signing up. So we do have a bunch of folks who many of you probably did not have a chance to look at. If you have not started working on this assignment, it is absolutely fine for you to trade for some of these people. And I want to point out, some of these people who are now at the end and no one has signed up for are actually super interesting people. Some of them are alums, so they're not current Oberlin students, but they're from a couple of years back who did really interesting things at Oberlin and have done interesting stuff since then, who might be really interesting for you to look at. So I just want to point out, you got some additional options that you didn't have earlier. But why are we doing that? The screen just stopped sharing. I don't know why I did that. Let me try that again. Okay, yeah, as long as you guys want to, as long as there's a free slot, you can do that. And like I say, there's some super interesting people down here who you might think about interviewing. I'll point out Abe Kruger, for instance. He's written a textbook on green buildings. He's a really interesting guy. Graduated a few years ago, but super interesting, interesting person, alum who was involved in all sorts of stuff when he was a student at Oberlin. So just saying, you got some options there. But so your assignment for today is to finish figuring out who you're going to interview and then come up with some questions that are simultaneously designed to elicit content that meets the core communication principles and are obviously targeted towards the person you're interviewing. So reading their biography. And again, we want to think about a target audience of Oberlin community members. So thinking about questions that are going to ask them about their experiences in the Oberlin community, so that we develop content that's relevant to that. So I wanted to point that out. The other thing I wanted to point out is that, as I've already said, we're going to be doing a case study on Tuesday's class. That case study is not quite posted yet because I want to revise it a little bit, but it'll be posted by Saturday. It's going to function the same way as the previous case study in the sense that each of you will be assigned a character to play. So it's very similar structure. The content is different, but each of you will be playing a different character. The overall scenario is a representative focused on a climate change bill, trying to navigate his constituency and his own objectives of trying to address climate change. So you'll represent a bunch of different sort of positions on that. And just like last time, Tuesday's class will be online, so we can have you work in groups. It'll be exactly the same setup as our last case study for Tuesday. So Tuesday's class will be online again, so that we can have you working in your groups as we did last time. Any questions on how that's set up? All right. Great. Any questions about anything right now before we launch into before I launch into introducing my colleague in a little bit greater depth, and before we actually get ourselves started here. All right. Well, seeing no questions right now, as I said, it's a great pleasure to be introducing one of my colleagues. We're going to have several additional guest lectures over the course of the semester. One of our objectives in this class is to give you sort of a taste of the work and the sort of thinking that various other faculty members in environmental studies are engaged in. And as I mentioned, Dr. Pothik is focused on sort of international environmental policy issues, particularly with respect to conflict on the environment, but also increasingly with respect to climate change climate change policy and politics at an international level. So the sort of international negotiations, she's got a component of her research that focuses on that. A little bit of background on Dr. Pothik. She received her PhD in political science at University of South Carolina, a master's in international studies and in Delhi, and a bachelor's degree as well in Delhi. So obviously she comes with that sort of international experience and perspective that she brings to bear on her research here. And it's really a great pleasure to be introducing Dr. Pothik. I think she's going to present a model of how change works at a political level that's going to be quite relevant, first of all, to the case study next week, but also to your thinking about how does one go about bringing about change? How does change occur within different kinds of systems? So Dr. Pothik is focused on sort of political systems and how change occurs. And obviously this is extraordinarily relevant to this particular moment in our history. So without further ado, Swapna, if you want to try sharing your screen, I think we're good to go here.
Yep. Just...
Great.
Okay. This is acting a bit weird. Just 1 second.
We had your screen up for a second there.
Yeah, I think this is, I'm using sort of 2 setups, so it's creating a bit of an issue here.
And we can actually see 2 of you online. You found yourself.
Okay. All right, so I don't know if people can see me and the screen, both of them, as me as an inset. Is that how it's working? Okay, wonderful. And throughout the course of the class, I will pose questions and we'll figure out whether John wants to be the mediator between me and everyone else in the class, or if I'm able to kind of directly communicate. So very happy to be here in these slightly unusual circumstances, unusual setup. This is not, I'm teaching remotely this semester, but since all the students are also remote, we interact via Zoom. So for me to be on Zoom and everybody to be in the same space, it's definitely a different kind of an experience, but I'm glad to be engaging with all of you. It's always exciting for me to interact with 101 students because I also teach a section of 101. It's our gateway course, and there's so much new information that's, sort of discussed and talked about in this class from such multiple disciplines, which is the most exciting thing for me about this course. Other than that, I also teach a class on environmental policy, as John mentioned, and that class particularly focuses on US environmental policy. I also teach another course on global environmental politics and another course on natural resources and conflict. So these are courses that are more closely aligned with my research. As John mentioned, my work primarily focuses on looking at international negotiations on climate change, particularly the dynamics between developing and developed countries, the role of non-governmental organizations in these negotiations. And a lot of it is also now focusing on global norms of climate justice and how they play a very important role in these negotiations as they occur, and how countries sort of interact with each other. So that's essentially what my research is focused on. So for this particular class, we are going to be talking about more in terms of US political system. And you guys, you all have already talked about systems and how systems behave, how parts within a system interact with each other, how they're interdependent. And my main purpose of this class is to have us start thinking about our political life as a system with different components within it and how they interact with each other. And most critically, to figure out where the leverage points in this system are to be able to make those changes that we want for a better environmental and social future. It's not easy. At no point do I insist that it can be done tomorrow, but it happens with sustained persistence and can be if we try to understand this system and try to listen to it and how it works. So that's pretty much what my aim is. And the outcome we're essentially looking for from this systemic intervention is environmental policy. So from there on, I want to sort of pose my first question, which is, why do we need environmental policies in the first place in our political life or in our social life? Why are they important?
You guys should go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll hold on. Let me just yes, no, I'm not muted. Let me just go ahead and try this. Let's go ahead and Emma, yeah, go ahead.
Invested obligation to care about the environment for their short-term needs. So policy helps regulate people as a whole without having to worry about the small and without having to like work with the small individual priorities of each party.
You able to hear that? So I can tell whether I should be repeating questions or whether you can hear those.
I could hear it in bits and pieces, not super clearly, but I could hear that the student said that policy is important so that it can create a general, again, I got a bit, I got it in bits and pieces. So maybe you might have to kind of translate that for me a little bit.
Okay, right. With the sort of the need for sort of collective organization as opposed to sort of individual. Other people have comments. Let's see if you guys can talk a little bit louder. Someone else wants to make a response to the question about the need for policy. Oh, come on, guys. Okay. Wow.
There might be factors that are left out that are critical for the environment and the coexistence of human and environment to exist. So without that specific policy, due to human error, that based on continuing off what Emma said, you could just forget or deliberately avoid trying to aid the ecosystem in a way that's sustainable.
Do we have a comment in the back? Yes, go ahead.
John, I am unable to hear this
I'll
particular
repeat
response.
it. So
Okay.
Noelle's point, I think you can hear me fine. Noelle's point was the sort of need for larger collective planning, that there needs to be some sort of a large scale plan of some sort. Yeah, and Sophie, what was your comment again? Right, so the need to sort of unify individual levels and collaborate on some sort of solution at the larger scale.
Yeah, so as you all are very appropriately pointing out, we need environmental policy to create a systemic expectation, a sense of predictability in terms of how our lives are going to be, right? So environmental policy essentially creates that sense of permanence of behavior. It gives people a sense of idea of what needs to be done. Because otherwise, if we don't have this general guideline or general sort of understanding of how we're supposed to behave, we don't know how to behave in a systemic fashion. So the typical way to think about it would be that environmental policies can be very critical to avoid what we know as the tragedy of the commons, right? So we have environmental resources, and we have people who depend on these environmental resources. And in order to make sure that these environmental resources are utilized in a long-term sustainable fashion, where we are thinking about sustainability in terms of the best use of the resources. Resources, but also in a sort of sustainable fashion, thinking about issues of equity, thinking about the longevity of these resources that we have. And it creates a sense of expectation, a norm of behavior, right? It solidifies how we're supposed to act in our society. So it gives us a lot of predictability, and we need that. Another thing that the policy does is that it gives us a lot of data, information. So just the process of policy creation requires a lot of data generation, a lot of information, which is very crucial to understanding how certain resources need to be used. So that's why we need policy to create a sense of permanency in behavior, to create a sense of predictability, for equitable distribution of resources, to essentially avoid a kind of tragedy of the commons in our resources. So where are we right now in terms of environmental policy within our current administration? So the picture doesn't look very, very rosy or positive, unfortunately. So at this point, we're in a time where more than 80 environmental rules at the federal levels, and regulations have been repealed or are in the process of being repealed by the current administration. Now the list is really, really long. Emissions make the
Hey, Swapna, can I get you to rewind about a minute, because we actually kind of lost you there for a minute. We've got some buggy internet. Sorry about that. Just
that's okay.
go back to the sort of 80 environmental rules and regulations.
Okay. Yeah, I was just essentially talking about how the present administration has essentially repealed or is in the process of repealing more than 80 federal environmental regulations. And I was going to sort of list out a few key ones that are very critical, especially from the perspective of CO2 emissions, climate change, etc. So the first one, which is very important, is that the Trump administration has repealed Obama's corporate average fuel economy standards, which were basically improved fuel efficiency standards that had been set up by the Obama administration to improve mileage and fuel efficiency in cars, and as a result decrease CO2 emissions. So those have been rolled back by the Trump administration. Very important ruling again, that the Trump administration has rescinded the EPA's Clean Power Plan that was introduced again during the Obama administration, which was essentially going to phase out all the old polluting coal-fired power plants, and has changed it to an affordable clean energy rule, which basically leaves a lot of these decision making at the state level instead of EPA implementing some of these regulations. So that would have been very critical in terms of lowering CO2 emissions by phasing out old coal-fired power plants, essentially, and then also encouraging a lot of investment and expansion of renewable energy. So all of that has been scrapped by the Trump administration. And by Trump administration EPA's own analysis, the most likely outcome of this new rule would result in 470 to 1,400 additional premature deaths. So this is Trump's EPA's own analysis of what would happen if Clean Power Plan is rescinded, essentially. But they've gone ahead and do it regardless. The administration has also rescinded a moratorium on coal leases on federal lands. So federal government owns large swaths of land and earns a lot of revenue by leasing these lands out for different kinds of resource extraction, including coal, or it could be petroleum, it could be natural gas, and all other kinds of resources. So the Obama administration had essentially put a moratorium that federal government would no longer lease out federal land for coal mining. And that has been rescinded by the Trump administration. This is probably one of the most sort of advertised activities by the Trump administration, that it pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement the first year that it came into office. Another very critical change that has happened, that there has been a sharp drop in lawsuits filed by the EPA and revenue collection. So what EPA typically does is that it has to constantly monitor whether different organizations are actually complying with environmental laws. And if these environmental laws are flouted, then they are expected to pay fines, right? So if EPA reduces that level of monitoring and lawsuits against these polluting companies, and it sort of declines in terms of its revenue collection by asking these companies to pay fine, that means the implementation of environmental laws is being compromised, right? So even though you have environmental policies and laws, the EPA is not doing a very good job at actually implementing those and ensuring that there is compliance. So
we've got a question for you.
Yes.
Go ahead, Elena. The question is how EPA calculates premature deaths.
So again, this is something that that has to be done with complicated processes of counterfactuals, like what would have happened if we had clean energy rule, depending on how much pollution it would have created, and typically how much pollution leads to lung or respiratory illness related deaths that typically happen. And based on how much more pollution will occur because the Clean Power Plan has been rescinded, how many more deaths could you basically see? So it's creating a counterfactual by looking at typically what is the relationship between the pollution and respiratory related illnesses and deaths that we have, and how much more pollution we will see, and how many more deaths will lead to that. Does that make sense? I hope
We got a yes on that one. We've got another question, Noel.
Mm-hmm.
The question is about contestation of the EPA and whether that has to, the extent to which that has to do with changes in the administrators of the EPA versus other factors.
So does that mean how does EPA function? Is that the question essentially?
I think the question is, why have these changes occurred? To what extent does it have to do with changes in administrators that are sort of like, driven by the administration versus external changes?
Okay, that's actually a great question. So EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is essentially what we call a federal agency or an executive agency. Which is typically by definition controlled by the by the executive branch of the government. Similarly, if you look at CDC, Center for Disease Control, if you look at Food and Drug Administration, FDA, right? So all these are essentially executive agencies that are controlled by the executive, which is the presidential branch of the government, which basically means that the people who are heading these agencies are appointed by the president. That's why you these days are hearing a lot of controversy around CDC and how the government is trying to influence the CDC or how the government is trying to influence the FDA, because the executive branch appoints the directors to these executive agencies. So if there is a change in the executive branch, you will see a change in the leadership of these agencies. Therefore, the functioning of this agency is completely dependent on who is controlling the executive branch. So that's why once the change of power happens from, say, Obama administration to Trump administration, the Trump administration will appoint its own people to the EPA, to CDC, to FDA, and therefore it will have that executive control of these agencies. So that's a great question. It's completely dependent on who holds the presidential office. Any other questions? Those are great questions.
I think we're good at the moment.
Okay. Thanks, John, for translating. I appreciate that. All right, so now the question is, how do we then start thinking about changing these facts, changing what's currently happening? And the answer is by understanding how the system works, by understanding how different components of these systems work, and from where environmental policy emerges. So there are multiple sources of environmental policy in our political system. So the first one, as you see on your top left, is the legislative branch, right? So that's the Congress we're talking about. We're talking about the House and the Senate, where laws are made, environmental policies are made, and therefore, that is the important legislative body to create environmental policies. The next one you see in the middle are essentially states. So states make environmental policies at their own level. So that is another source. The bottom left that you see is the Supreme Court, which in turn means the judiciary. So a lot of environmental rulings over the last couple of decades have been coming from the judicial branch. And part of the reason is that we are seeing so much deadlock in the Congress or between the Congress and the executive branch that a lot of these environmental rules have to be cleared by the judiciary. So Supreme Court makes a lot of rulings that have huge implications for essentially environmental policy. On your right, bottom right, you see the presidents, which is the executive branch, which of course through various mechanisms is also responsible for making environmental policies. So the president can sign executive orders. The president typically shapes the agenda that the Congress takes up. If the president has a solid environmental agenda, it will push that. The presidential office will try to push it through the Congress. The other avenue that the presidency has is through the executive agencies. So coming back to what we just talked about, executive agencies like the EPA, which are completely under the executive branch, and a lot of environmental legislation is executed through these executive agencies, and sometimes these executive agencies will make their own environmental policy related decisions, which of course become controversial because then people complain that, well, it's not the Congress deciding, it's the executive branch deciding what the environmental policies should look like. But historically, EPA has played a very significant role in creating environmental policies that are applied across the board. So that's sort of parts of the system that one needs to understand where environmental policy is coming from. The other aspect to understand is sort of some of these key insights that we have from academic research on how political process works. So we know that politicians respond to political pressure. We also know that corporations have the least influence over an issue that has strong public support. So if public strongly believes that pre-existing conditions should be covered by medical insurance, then big medical insurance companies would have very little influence on that outcome. But the fundamental idea is that that public support needs to be channeled through proper routes, right? It has to be lobbied through proper routes to show that public support exists for something like pre-existing conditions being considered when you're thinking about insurance. Another important finding is that people care about things that they feel affect them. People do not tend to care much about things that they feel is not going to bother them or is not something that is relevant for their lives, right? Another insight we have is that if laws are not passed in the US Congress, then there are different and other avenues for policy making. So we have to look at other ways. We just talked about judiciary, we talked about state level governance, where we can think about laws being passed if the US government, if the US Congress is not really passing the laws that we want to. So based on some of these insights and sort of structural factors that exist in our political system, I just wanted to show you a couple of graphs here and sort of get some feedback on what you think is going on there. So here is a graph on Americans' views on global warming, all right? And this was essentially data collected through Gallup polls. And you see a trend, a time trend data essentially, where people have been asked these multiple questions and you're seeing how these sort of responses are increasing or decreasing from people. So the first question is that do people believe that global warming is caused by human activities? So you can see the trend line there from 2001 to 2019. The second question is, do people say most scientists believe global warming is occurring? Again, you can see the trend line. believe effects of global warming has already begun, think global warming will pose a serious threat in their lifetime, worry a great deal about global warming, think the news underestimates the seriousness of global warming. So anything that jumps out at you when you look at this particular graph of what people believe in.
Yeah. So Kayla's noticing that patterns of sort of perception that scientists believe in global warming went up a little bit and then went down. Maybe I'll take a bunch of comments and then I'll let you respond to them.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Ian. Yeah, so there's Ian's noticing that 2017 kind of there's some peak there and some question about that. Phoebe. Yeah, so Phoebe's pointing out that is asking the question of whether that relates to when we pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord as a comment. Mm-hmm. Anyone else have other sort of comments, things they want to say about this? Yeah, go ahead, Mess. Yeah, just a sort of observation that there's that the whole notion of people sort of like their perception of what scientists as opposed to just sort of figuring out what scientists actually think, that's sort of like a thing, I guess, is what you're noticing. Yeah, Ava. Yeah, so Ava's noticing that bottom line on you know the news underestimates is sort of countering the increases that you know 2017 when several things increased is it counters the sort of bottom line. So yeah. All right, why don't you go? So hopefully hopefully you'll remember some of what was said there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think these are all very good observations, and it gives us a very interesting insight into the minds of American people and what they're thinking about global warming. And as you can see, there are these trend lines that you've noticed around science and what people, how much people believe in science. And we'll sort of think about those trend lines a bit more. The thing I wanted to particularly, I would like you to particularly focus is the trend line where people think that global warming will pose a serious threat in their lifetime, right? So if you look at that trend line, we are still under majority, right? We don't have majority of people or more than majority of people believing that global warming will pose a serious threat in their lifetime. They believe that global warming is happening by human activities. There, the numbers are pretty high. It's 66%. But when you ask them whether you are going to be affected by global warming or climate change, then the numbers look very different, right? And based on the kind of research we have on people's motivations to do something about political issues, we know that people care more about things that affect them personally, right? So you could be having global warming in theory, you could believe global warming is happening, but if you don't think it's threatening your existence, then you would not be motivated enough to do something about it. So this is sort of an important insight into how most Americans still feel that global warming is not really going to pose a threat in their lifetime. They are not going to be affected by it, which affects their seriousness towards tackling the situation. So moving towards kind of these other broader trends that you all noticed in terms of science and the news underestimating the seriousness of global warming, I have another slide that I wanted to share with you. And this is giving you a trend line when people were asked, you know, what are some of the issues that they worry about, and they had to categorize whether they worry about these issues a fair amount, or a great deal. So this is the percentage of people who said that they worry a great deal about climate change. Okay, so you can clearly see a very interesting trend line here, which is going up and down by on a fairly regular interval. So I would like to see if you had any guesses on why we are seeing dips where we are seeing, and why we are seeing the sort of increases that we are seeing in this trend line where people worry a great deal about global warming or climate change.
Larissa first, yes. So Larissa's pointing out potential relationship with election years, and maybe I'll go ahead and take some other comments as well. Liz, you had a comment? Yeah, so Liz is suggesting maybe it went down when the Obama administration was in, and inferring that that may have had to do with a perception that the problem was being addressed.
And people were like, I think maybe, and then in 2008 with the recession, and maybe like just general like national turmoil, like the general opinion of the country was like concerned, but also like with stuff like the stability of the economy and other like events that bring into or just thinking about the future of the country.
Yeah, let me try to generalize what I think Emma is saying is that there are times when national events cause people to focus, storms or something like that, that cause people to focus on climate related stuff, and times when things like recessions cause people to focus on other stuff. Maybe we'll take one more. Sophia, yeah. Yeah, so Sophia was going to make the same point. So yeah, Swapna, why don't you reflect on these guys?
Yeah, so I think those are absolutely on target. So what you're seeing in these trend lines are all these other social, economic, and global factors that are playing into people's worries about climate change, right? So let's go to the very beginning. And if you see sort of this increase in 2001, around 2001, that's sort of a very high mark that you're reaching, where 40% people are worried about climate change and global warming. If you think about what was happening globally at that time, a few things were happening. One was that the Clinton administration at that time, you all were probably, I don't know, you probably weren't even born at that time, obviously. But Clinton administration had just signed the Kyoto Protocol, and that was the sort of precursor to the Paris Agreement. So there was a lot of national enthusiasm and concern about climate change. And those international events are definitely sort of feeding in to people's awareness about the issue. So there's a lot of concern about climate change around that time. And then at the same time, you have in 2001, George Bush coming into power, and people then worrying that this administration is not really going to do anything about environmental issues. So typically what you see in people's attitudes towards climate change is that when there is a president or a federal government that they think is going to care about the environment, they tend to worry less, right? So people tend to compensate for what they expect the government is going to do typically. If they think that the government is going to do a good job, or they feel confident about the government taking steps on environmental issues, then people worry less about environmental issues. So that's one scientific That's one kind of finding that we have. And some of that you can see in these trend lines. The other thing that happened in 2001 is the World Trade Center attacks, right? So that essentially, that event basically completely changed national attention away from issues of the environment and climate change. People were more worried about national security. Now you look at around 2004, 2005, you see a trend line then going up. And the reason why that happened, one could explain, is Hurricane Katrina happened. And Katrina was one of the first hurricanes that was very successfully connected to climate change in public rhetoric. So people started worrying about that. Al Gore's movie, The Inconvenient Truth, had come out. So that created a lot of awareness. Plus people were worried because they could see that the federal government is not doing enough about climate change and environmental issues. So you see that trend line going up to 41 in 2008. And then in 2008, as one of you mentioned, Obama administration came into power and people thought, well, this government is going to do an okay job on the environment, so we can sit back and relax. So that could be one explanation of why you see that trend line as falling. The other big explanation is the recession, right? So again, if people are concerned about national security, if people are concerned about economic future, their jobs and employment, then climate change always takes a backseat. People don't really care about it. So you can see these events sort of happening and how the issue of climate change and how people think it's important or them worrying about it is so contingent on these other socioeconomic and political factors. Other than that, what I wanted to show you was a second trend line, because that trend line actually doesn't give us a full picture, because it is giving us an aggregate attitude of what people feel. What is more critical if we think about our political system, if you think of it in a more strategic, systemic fashion, then you need to look at disaggregate attitudes towards climate change, right? Because the way our election system works, we don't really need majority to win on issues. We need essentially sort of a win through the electoral college, which basically means that you don't really need to care about the majority of people believing whether climate change is real, or do we need people to sort of worry about climate change in a sense of majority. We only need a selective minority that essentially dictates what issue gets on the agenda, right? So the way our political system is structured, you can completely win the political system and win it on the basis of a lot of people completely not believing or worrying about climate change at all. So as you can see in this trend map, that if you look at the disaggregated numbers, you see the number of Republicans that worry a great deal about climate change is very, very little, right? And you can win the sort of American presidency, the Senate, absolutely on the basis of these low numbers, right? You don't really have to worry about the majority of people who are worried about climate change. So it gives you some insight into, you know, how the distribution of our electorate has a huge impact in terms of who believes in climate change and who do you have to sort of satisfy in terms of your constituents to actually win the election, right? So you can completely win the election dealing with constituents who just don't care about climate change. So you don't really have to worry about people who do care about climate change because they don't really matter in that case. So that's an interesting idea, and it is essentially called a selectorate, where you don't have to worry about the majority, you only have to worry about enough people who will get you elected, right? So any questions so far about this? Any thoughts?
I think people are good at the moment now, Swapna.
Okay. So another thing to sort of complicate, I'm going to share this second screen that I have here. Okay, I can find it. Okay. Right. So now here's another data where you are looking at numbers where people are essentially asked, what do they think is the most important problem in the United States? And these are the responses that people have made. So for economic problems, you see the trend line that 13% of the people believe that economic problems are the most pressing problems of our time. That's increasing to about 19 in May this year, and then that went down to 9 in July. However, the biggest number, as we expect, the problem is coronavirus, right? So you have 45% people thinking that coronavirus is the most important problem of our time. You have 20% in May, and then you have about 30% in July. So what do you notice here when it comes to the environment? Where does that stand in terms of how important people think it is?
Yeah, go ahead. Just noting how low it is there, Swapna.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what these graphs are basically telling you that we have a lot of problem in terms of how environment is viewed as an issue in our American political system, right? Because we in Oberlin, surrounded by people who think like us, believe that environment is the most important problem, is a very critical issue, is an existential dilemma. But when it comes to the greater political system, the issue of environment is competing with a lot of other issues. The issue of environment is also something that people think that, or issue of climate change is also something that people don't believe is going to affect them, right? Or it is an issue that is so dependent on other socio-economic factors to be important in people's mind. So it might seem like an obviously important issue in our minds, but when it comes to the greater political system, it is competing with a lot of other issues for attention, just in people's psyche and in also what the politicians would probably want to work on. So for example, if you look at how important people think climate or environmental issues are vis-a-vis other issues, it ranks so low. So if I'm a politician who's coming into power, then my priority is going to be fixing things that people think are more important than environment or climate change, right? So I would be worrying about looking at this data. I would be worrying about the economy. I would be worrying about coronavirus. I would be worrying about race relations or racism. However, a smart person would say that all of these things are connected to the environment. You know, nothing is separate. But that's not how things are relayed in our political discourse. So that's definitely one of the problems that can be addressed through the model that we are going to be discussing. So the question is, how do we then address this issue of environmental issues or climate change competing with so many other factors, and then also being dependent on so many other socioeconomic contexts that we live in? So let me go back to my original screen share here. Okay, so the model that I want to propose here, which would be useful in us thinking about putting environment back on the political agenda, is the multiple streams model, which was proposed by John Kingdon, who was an ex-OB. And it's one of the most influential books in public policy, which essentially talks about how can we put our issue on the agenda? How can we make our issue important for the political agenda? Because just the way Congress works, just the way our political system works, it can only focus on very few issues at a time, or it can only take up very few issues at a time to legislate on. So how can we put our issue, which in this case is climate change or the environment, on the political agenda? So that's the question he's trying to answer. And he basically proposes that there are three streams. We need to think about our political system in this sort of three streams, where there is a problem stream, there is a policy stream, and there's a politics stream that are sort of independently floating in this political ether. And once in a while, a moment comes in time when a policy window opens up and these three different streams combine, and you're finally able to put your agenda for political legislation, for policy making. So I wanted to go over these streams just in a bit more details. So the problem stream essentially is how you're defining the issue, how you're thinking about the issue. What is the issue itself? So some of the ways through which the problem stream essentially becomes evident is through scientific evidence, right? So for example, the ozone hole, which was discovered by the scientists, that problem essentially came to public light through that scientific evidence. So science can essentially indicate that this is a problem that needs to be solved. Then the second aspect of problem stream can be dramatic events, accidents, or some crisis. So if you see California forests on fire, that's a dramatic event that will tell people that, hey, there's a problem here we need to fix. Or some kind of accident or crisis, which could be something like a hurricane, right? The critical thing here is that issues have to be framed as problems, that people don't automatically take issues and think that this is a problem. Those issues could be very, very benign, but you have to be actively framing those issues as a problem, right? So for example, when you think about a hurricane, right? Now, hurricane is an issue, causes a lot of damage, causes a lot of personal, human, structural, economic damage, and is therefore a problem. But what kind of a problem is it, right? That's the tactical political framing. Do you frame it as a problem of cities not having levees or enough protection from the storm surge or the water coming inward? Do you have the problem of urban planning, where we have essentially created all this housing on coastline that is vulnerable to these kinds of hurricanes? Or is the problem something systemic like climate change, right? So that same hurricane can be framed as different problems depending on what kind of policy solution you're looking at, right? So let's think about coronavirus, right? Now that's a problem. But the question is, what are some of the different ways in which this problem can be framed? So I would, again, this is a question to all of you. How would you frame coronavirus as a problem?
Yeah, go ahead, Emma.
Lack of coordinated governmental response and public trust to fight that.
Okay, so two factors suggested: lack of coordination and lack of framing as a scientific problem.
Okay.
Lack of trust in science. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Other thoughts on that? Yeah, go ahead. No. Right. So economic framing in terms of sick people, closing of the economy.
This isn't like personal friendship. I know that a lot of prominent people on the right stuff or framing it kind of as like almost like an immigration problem, like the whole like believing it's like China's fault that this all happened and it's just China's fault. So that's kind of the way they framed it.
Right. So Hannah's suggesting that this is being framed by the Trump administration as sort of like a foreign, particularly China problem causing from elsewhere. Liz?
Um, more interactions between wild animals and human interactions like livestock or just even like Ebola started because there was a fruit tree and the bat ate from my fruit tree and then a child ate the rock fruit that was on the ground and that's how we go. So like it's more like the more we start interacting with these species and the less biodiverse they are, you can just kind of have that as well.
Right. Okay. So a quick summary of that: framed as a biodiversity / human versus nature issue. Encroaching of humans on nature, increasing transmission of pathogens. Adriana. Right. So framing in terms of individual rights and responsibilities versus collective rights and responsibilities. Yeah. Great stuff.
Yeah, so I think this is great stuff. So these are very, very interesting ways in which we are seeing the problem of coronavirus being framed, right? That, there's a disbelief in science, there's a lack of coordination by the administration, there is a general issue of, individual right versus public good. So these are very, very important issues which are being sort of brought in as we are problematizing coronavirus. Now, the question, though, is how do we use sort of political strategy? I mean, what is our end goal in framing coronavirus as a particular problem, right? So if you're framing coronavirus as a problem of people not believing in science, and that's sort of the issue here, what is our end goal in terms of policy outcome, right? Or if if we're thinking about coronavirus as a problem that is caused because of lack of governmental coordination, what is our policy outcome? So when we're thinking about strategic policy making, we have to frame an issue as a problem that can have a solid solid policy outcome, right? So are we trying to really create a policy where we are setting up a, say, pandemic unit in the White House, right? So that would be the use of framing this problem as a lack of governmental coordination, because our ultimate policy goal there is to set up a pandemic unit, right? Now, something new that you're seeing these days is framing coronavirus to get some outcome on healthcare, right? So now we are really worried about healthcare, the issue of healthcare, especially pre-existing conditions for people, is in the Supreme Court, right? And that is essentially a very important decision making, a decision that the Supreme Court might be presiding over. So if we use this coronavirus as a problem where we frame it as something that is going to have this fundamental impact on the clause of pre-existing conditions, that people who have coronavirus are all going to be counted, coronavirus is going to be counted as pre-existing condition and would be denied a lot of healthcare if this particular ruling is passed, if pre-existing conditions are eliminated by the Supreme Court. So that is a strategic framing of this coronavirus problem, which is actually geared towards some kind of policy outcome, right? So that's the kind of strategic framing that we're looking at, that it needs to be geared towards a kind of policy outcome that we want. We could also strategically frame coronavirus as, thinking about how it highlights inequities in our social life, how people are disproportionately being affected by this problem and raise issues of social equity, right? Or raise issues of how people who don't have jobs will automatically not have healthcare and therefore are not going to be able to access healthcare if they do get COVID, right? So you can frame it as a problem of healthcare access. So it needs to be geared towards some kind of a policy demand, right? It is a problem. It is a problem of all kinds. It's a problem of human nature interface. It's a problem of lack of belief in science, but that's not really getting us to a policy outcome. We need a policy outcome, and that's why we need a strategic framing of this problem. So that's the first issue that we need to be thinking about. Another way in which problem is highlighted is through current policies and what their feedback is. So that gives us an insight into a problem, and we can frame that strategically to change the policies because they're clearly not working the right way. The second stream that Kingdon talks about is the policy stream. So now the policy streams are policy stream is basically a stream where all the solutions exist, right? So for example, if you're thinking about issue of CO2 emissions, some of the proposed solutions that you will discuss in the next case study would be carbon tax, would be cap and trade, where these legislators are trying to decide what their options are. Or it could be efficiency, or it could be some sort of an executive action like the Obama administration did, which was the Clean Power Plan. One of the key goals was to phase out the coal-fired power plants. So there are multiple solutions to the same problem, and that's essentially the policy stream. So these are solutions generated by specialists and stakeholders, right? And the most important thing about these solutions is that there needs to be one, right? You cannot push for social reform, policy reform, if you don't have a solution, right? When you try to lobby in the political system, you need to provide clear-cut solutions that legislators could be forced to work on. You can't just highlight a problem and not offer a solution. That's not politically strategic at all. So there are multiple solutions that can exist for a particular issue. And again, how you frame a problem is very related to what sort of solutions you're looking for a particular issue area. The third is the politics stream. So that could be administrative and legislative turnover, who's in the Congress, who's leading the executive branch, what the national mood is like, are there other confounding factors, and organized political forces. So again, we're not just talking about opinion polls or how people feel, but we are thinking about organized political forces. So Citizens Climate Lobby, 350.org, some of these are big environmental groups, organizations that are dedicated to policy advocacy work. So you need to have solutions, and you need to have organized channels to communicate those solutions to your legislators, right? So just majority of people believing climate change is a problem is not going to solve that problem. You need to have organized political forces that are able to effectively communicate viable solutions to your representatives, right? So now Kingdon says that, well, these three streams exist, and then once in a while, policy windows open up. Now, these policy windows can be predictable, and the predictable policy windows would be elections. If elections are happening, we know that's happening. So those are something that we can be prepared for, because change in administration can mean better opportunities for different policy agendas. And some policy windows are unpredictable. So you could have a sudden accident, for example. So when the big BP oil spill happened a few years ago, I think it was back in 2009, it opened up a policy window to safeguard offshore drilling, right? To put more stringent measures on on offshore drilling, and also ban offshore drilling in many parts of the country. So that particular unfortunate incident opened up an unexpected policy window for dealing with offshore drilling issues, right? But the point is that there had to be forces that were prepared to come up with policy solutions at that time when these unexpected windows opened up. Again, related to the idea of predictable policy windows, another thing we talk about is venue shopping, which is that, again, if you can't find solutions at the congressional level, if Congress is not doing anything, then you need to seek help of the judiciary. You need to rely on state and local elections, try to influence those, because a lot of environmental policy is implemented at a local level. So that's a great avenue to make an impact. And then the last one is, again, collective organization. Not majority opinion, but organized collective work that has a huge impact. So again, any questions so far?
Any questions? Yes, we do. Elena. So the question is like bang for your buck in terms of whether you focus at national or more regional, or I'll add in more local level.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a perfect segue for what I was going to talk about next, which is the issue of scale when we think about political systems and intervention. So again, it's when we think about time scale, time horizon, the input of money and efforts required, there is a hierarchy of those when we are thinking about different levels of intervention. So of course, it's relatively easy to intervene in local issues and to influence local issues than global issues, right? So it's easier to influence a climate policy that your local city is trying to devise vis-a-vis a global climate agreement. You need many more resources and outreach. The higher you go up on the level, the more difficult it becomes. So yeah, you're right. It is a strategic question where you should focus your resources. And the answer is that it's very tough, right? Because in the short run, it seems more satisfying to work at a local level where you're able to see quick changes and quick results. If people respond to you, if you're smart enough to create the right kind of political pressure and organization, then you'll see quicker impact at the local level. And then of course, at the national level, it gets much more frustrating. But again, as someone who works on international politics, I have seen people who have been involved in global climate negotiations for the last 30, 40 years, right? And they have gone through these ups and downs with climate, these big international agreements being signed and then reneged by countries like the United States. And imagine how frustrating they felt, how demotivating it must have been for them. But I also really feel amazed by their persistence, right? By how much they are still passionate about their issue, that something needs to happen at the global level to make a change, that they have been involved in this issue for the past 50, 60 years, even if they do not see the result, not for themselves, but maybe thinking about their future generations. So it is a very, very tough call. But I always encourage my students to, of course, be involved in local activities, local level, but don't feel dejected if you don't see things moving at national and global level, because the bottom line is that we have to persist. We have to keep doing something, because I feel like if we can afford to not do anything, then we are enjoying the privilege that comes with just not doing anything, because our lives are, again, not at stake. So we can afford to not do anything about things at the national and global level and sit back and, not worry about it. So it requires a great deal of persistence. It's very difficult to make an impact at a national and global level, but someone has to do it. Someone needs to stay engaged. So that's typically how I emphasize this in my class, that it has to be done, because if you're not doing it, then you're definitely benefiting from the status quo, and you have that privilege to benefit from it, right? All right, so I guess
where are you in terms of wrapping up? Because we do have more questions, but I want to calibrate it to what you want to, how you want to conclude.
Right, so I think after this, I was just going to show a little video of Green New Deal, but you were saying you were already going to discuss that as part of the case study. So I can basically send you that video and the related questions to that video, and maybe the class can talk about it. And I can take any other questions that
What do you guys want to do? Do you want to do the video and Green New Deal, or do you want to do questions? We'll do what you had planned. Go ahead, Swapna.
Okay, so it was a quick video that I wanted to show you. And as you can see, the video is when the Green New Deal was being announced by AOC. So I'll play this little snippet where she's talking about what the whole Green New Deal is. And then I'll pose some questions, but I doubt that we'll have time to, because we go till 10:50, right?
Yeah, we got about 3 more minutes.
Yeah, so I'll just pose the questions, and then maybe you can, think about it, mull over, and talk about during the case study if you can. So here it is.
You know what, we're not getting sound on it, Swapna, and I'm sure we could work that out, but I'm inclined, since we got 2 minutes left, to let Madison ask her questions.
Yeah, I can send you the video later on.
Brett, we must.
I guess you were seeing the video now, or were you not?
Let's skip the video. We're going to ask one question
okay.
in our last, Madison, one question.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, I'm going to have to summarize that because we don't have that much time. So Madison is saying, okay, she gets it that there's this situation where you don't actually need a majority to get stuff done. The question is, how do you motivate the minority who actually is with you, but maybe isn't engaged? I think that's a piece of summary.
And I think that's where, when you go back to the 3 streams, that's where the problem stream comes in. That's where effective communication and political organization comes in. That you have to make people believe or make them understand that this issue is going to affect them. And also at the beginning, I talked about how people tend to sort of separate environmental issues from economic issues or health issues. Again, the key then is to effectively communicate with people that all these things are connected. So a lot of it is riding on how we politically frame the issue of the environment that actually connects with people in different ways that matters to them, right? So it's all about political organization and mobilization in a strategic and effective manner to make people sort of understand that climate change is not such a thing that's separate from their economic, political, and social lives. It's all connected. and it's important, and it's going to affect them in their lifetime, so.
Thank you so much, Swapna. Let's give Swapna a hand. You can't hear folks that well, but it's
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Don.
All
Take
right.
care. Take care, all of you.